So I proposed a design to Viking, and they were very happy with it. And just before we went to press, they showed it to Waterstones, who decided they didn't like it. And Viking's first response was to, I've gone off screen. Can you all see me?
I can see you.
Okay, fine. Viking's first response was to cancel the design because they said if Waterstones don't like it, they will not buy as much stock. And I put my foot down and I said, all the independent bookshops who really know how to sell me will love this cover. And I was really insistent not to say a little bit pushy about it. Much to the surprise of my agent, they gave in. And it sold so well that Waterstones made it their book of the month for the paperback. So that's what we think about Waterstones' sense of design. And after that, I've had a hand in the design of Grandmothers, which sadly fell a bit foul of the first set of lockdowns. And most recently this book, which I particularly wanted to have the kind of scarlet colours that you get in winter and autumn berries, hawthorn and holly, and rose hips and rowan berries, which all appear in the book. So I think they've done really well, and I'm so glad you like it, because you are the kind of shop that knows what my kind of readers like.
That's incredibly flattering. So first, thank you. I would love to talk a little bit about how the book came about, but I also want to make sure that everybody tuning in knows on the chat function, I would welcome if you have any topics, suggestions, questions to share with Salley. I will be passing them on as and when they come in. So don't be shy, although you are welcome simply to watch. Can you talk a little bit to the derivation of the book? There's so much research in it. And I would be hard pressed to know whether the book came first or the research.
Well, it's set in a part of England called the Welsh Marches, or as the Daily Mail likes to call it, the Welsh Marshes, because I don't think they've heard of the Welsh Marches. They are actually rather hilly area, which is the borderland, ancient borderland between England and Wales. And I used to have a house literally a stone's throw on the Welsh side of the border. If you came out of my house and crossed a bridge, a little bridge over a river, you got into Wales. So it's an area I've always been very interested in. It's the area where George Herbert, a poet I love, and Thomas Traherne also lived. And it's got a very ancient history, and there's a great deal of ancient British history around that area. And I say British because it dates back to well before the Romans, really, the kind of history. So I was wanting to write a book about this area for some time, and I got very interested in the holy wells that still survive from, well, what I thought was the Celtic Christian period when I started looking into this. Turns out they're much older. Turns out that the Christians pretty much took over from pagan sites of worship. And the pagan sites of worship, pre-Roman, pre-Christian, were both sites of water, pools and streams, and wells and springs, but also trees and groves. And the Christians cut down the sacred trees and sacred groves because they thought they were idolatrous. But they couldn't really do anything about the water, because water you can't get rid of it very easily. So they took those over and they allotted them to various 7th and 8th century saints. So that's what I was in the process of uncovering. And it's a part of the world that has extant some very beautiful old Jacobean houses. It's a part of the world where, I mean, a lot of Elizabethan and Jacobean buildings, apart from little pockets like Stratford-on-Avon, have been demolished. But that part of the world, they're preserved. So I had this notion of a rambling old Jacobean house set in this rather ancient landscape. And then lockdown happened. And normally when I'm writing a book, it's an area I already knew very well because I lived there, and I'd also done a lot of hunting down the holy wells, and finding out about the saints that took them over and performed all manner of miracles. I mean, as somebody in the book says, it was an age of miracles. We can't do them anymore. But I couldn't go and be actually in that landscape while I was writing it, which is what I like to do with a book, even if I know it very, very well, the landscape. So I'd rented a cottage in Wiltshire with a big and neglected garden. And I started to garden, as a lot of people did during lockdown. And that took me back to my very early childhood. When I was about 3 or 4, my dad lost his job. He was a communist, and he lost his job through being a communist. So we went to live with my godmother and her husband, who didn't have any children, but they had a big garden, a walled garden. And I became like their sort of surrogate child. And one of the first things I learned to do with my godmother was garden. And in particular, I had a sort of magical relationship with a wild white cherry tree that grew in her garden, with which I felt I was in communion as a child. I think a lot of children have this ability. We grow out of it, sadly. But I was very sure that the tree and I, there were spirits in the tree, and that the tree and I were in touch. And then one sad day for me, when I was about 8 or 9, there was a hurricane and the tree was blown down. And I remember this as being one of the first really traumatic experiences of my life, the loss of this tree. So there was this at the back of my mind. And then some years ago, I was at the Edinburgh Festival, and there were people asking questions about I can't even remember which book it was, because it doesn't matter. And there was this rather intense, rather serious looking woman sitting in the front row. And at the end of this session, she put up her hand and she asked to ask me a question. And her question was this. She said, "The last time I saw you here, I asked you what book you were writing next. And you said you were writing a book about a garden. And I'm still waiting for it." So here I am at the beginning of lockdown, March 2020, and I've got my holy wells, and I've got my Welsh Marches, and I've got the Shropshire border and my house. And I suddenly thought, I know what this book's going to be about. It's going to be about a garden. And my godmother, to whom I owed a huge debt. I mean, she was a very important, she really saved my bacon. My mother was an admirable woman, but not terribly easy to get on with. She had both her legs amputated during the war, and that made her difficult and prickly. So my godmother was very, very significant and important to me. And this gift she gave me of gardening came back to me in lockdown. And of course, throughout the country, those of us who were lucky enough to be in a situation where we had gardens were also beginning to find the kind of solace and nourishment that gardening can give you. So without me really having to think about it, the Jacobean house, where I'd already set my principal character on the Shropshire borders, acquired this large and neglected garden that I knew she was going to work on. And what happened was, I would get up in the morning in my nightdress. I always write in my nightdress, and I would have my 1 cup of tea and 3 cups of coffee, which is essential for me before I can do a thing. And I'd write. And then very often I wouldn't get dressed. I'd stick on a jumper and put on a pair of Wellington boots and go out into the garden and start digging the garden. And then I'd come back, have a kind of scrappy lunch, and then I would edit what I'd written in the morning. And so working on this garden physically and observing the birds, particularly the birds, and the trees, particularly the trees, because there weren't very many plants. Mostly it was nettles and brambles. the whole process of that kind of got into the writing of the book. And I am one of those lucky people who, and I feel a bit guilty about this, really enjoyed lockdown, because the whole of the book really was the result of that enforced period of almost isolation, because I do live alone. I mean, I did see my family, but only in small snippets, as all of us did. And I wasn't a great fan of Zoom. So it was a bit like a reversal of my childhood, whereas the garden was my godmother's child. This garden became my child, I suppose. And that's how it emerged.
Was the process very different, because as you lived through the isolation, was the process of writing very different from your previous writing?
It was calmer. Once I'm in a book, I'm always pretty enthralled to it. I usually have a bit of a bumpy time getting in. I will start off very eagerly, then I'll think, oh, I don't want to write this book. What other book can I write? Because I've usually got 2 or 3 in the back of my mind. Then I think, oh no, come on, pull yourself together and push on. I sort of push on a bit. But once I've got over, I call it a sleeping policeman, like you get the humps in the road. Once I've got over that hump, then it's pretty much, I'm going to say downhill, but that makes, that's the wrong analogy, because I don't want to make it sound as though it's a deterioration. But it's pretty much self-fulfilling after that. And there does come a point where I really don't want to do anything else. But I think this had a calm about it, because, I mean, believe me, I missed particularly my grandchildren. I mean, I missed them like mad. And I also missed meeting my readers, because I was due to do a lot of events with grandmothers, and I really like meeting my readers and doing events. It's what makes up for the isolation of the writing period. But once I'd reconciled myself to the relative isolation, I went very zen. I went really accepting, and I really got involved in the garden, and particularly, it's a very beautiful countryside around where I am in Wiltshire, and in fact, it's quite similar in a way to the Welsh Marches. The Wansteig, which is an ancient earthwork, almost meets up with Offa's, which is the ancient earthwork that cuts across, that divides England and Wales, or did divide England and Wales. And of course, there's Avebury and the Stonehenge, and there's there's many Roman sites around. So I would walk on the Wansteig, which would remind me of Offa's, and there's several white horses that I got very involved with and might write about in another book. And in a way, I think many of us learnt, those of us who are lucky to be in the countryside, I think not for people in town, particularly not people in small flats, for whom I felt almost guilty that I had that privilege. But I think there was something very sustaining about it. And of course, it made me think a great deal about nature. And although I never wanted this book to be any kind of polemic, I did feel writing it that the virus is a natural phenomenon. We don't quite yet know how it emerged, but I do think the ways in which we have played fast and loose with natural resources, and the way we have, through civilization, so-called, despoiled nature, has probably got a role in how we come to be subjected to this. I mean, it's really a plague. And I felt that in writing the book, that there's a great deal about the nourishing and restorative power of nature in the book, particularly through the garden. But I hope there's also a sense of some of the destructive power of nature as well, because nature is not good or bad. It's both. It's neither and both. It's light and dark. And And I hope that some of the dark side of nature also came through. And some of the dark side of human nature also came through, as well as, of course, the other side.
I um I wonder, this leads us on to into really the meat of the book, which there's quite a bit to touch on. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the number of dualities that you inserted, and in my view, the way they became less dual over time and transformed into quite subtle points about relationships, history, and understanding. Do you set out to formulate that kind of process?
No, I don't set out to do anything really. I honestly only set out, I can honestly say, and I think this is true of every book I've done, that the only thing I set out with is a very distinctive, I'm going to say landscape, but I mean in one book it's a boat, so environment, and the principal character's name and voice. By voice, I don't just mean how he or she speaks, obviously, I mean how, what kind of, what I'm hearing. I don't set out anything. I haven't got the story or anything else. So I don't, you said insert, and I don't mean to take you up on that, but I don't insert anything. But I was a trained psychoanalyst, and before that I was a teacher of English literature. So dualities within particularly human nature have been very much my bread and butter. And as I said earlier, I am very interested in the duality of nature. I think, are you maybe principally referring to the relationship between the two sisters, who are the principal relationship in the book?
Well, I certainly think Halcyon or Hassie and Margot were central, but I felt in my reading there's both parallels and oppositions between husbands and wives, between parents and children, between siblings, town and country, religion and magic. The parallels you set up in what I take to be sort of a dynamic tensions that are resolved, that in time become not irrelevant, but it widens out. It becomes not dual, but something else.
Yes, I think it's very hard actually not to write about dualities in some way or other. I mean, one of the dualities that you haven't mentioned that I was particularly interested in and have been particularly interested in, I think throughout all my books, is past and present. And if we go back to the landscape and place, we have the past that Hassie begins to uncover about the location. She's moved to this place. Perhaps I should set it a bit more. She's moved to this derelict house, Jacobean house, with her sister Margot, which they have bought with the proceeds from their father's will. And it's an uneasy relationship because they've never really got on. The mother has favored Margot, the elder sister. The father, less overtly, has favored Hassie, the younger child. And they are living in this house in the countryside, having both been urban people. So that's sort of one of your first dualities. And the countryside they're living in, as I've suggested earlier, is a very ancient countryside. So that is in contrast to the contemporary countryside, which is best represented, I suppose, by the village which the house sits just outside, about a mile or so outside, which is an imaginary village, because I decided to make it an imaginary village so as not to fall foul of any actual Shropshire villages that might somehow decide I was writing about them, which is a trap you can fall into as a writer. It's called Hope Wenlock, Hope being a very common place name around there. It's the Old English for sitting on the side of a valley. And Wenlock comes from Wenlock Edge, and there's a famous place called Much Wenlock, which actually also features in the book, which has a very ancient, the remains of an ancient priory, and the former remains of an ancient priory of one of the saints, that Saint Milberger, who comes into the book. So the contemporary village is just recovering from Brexit, from the whole Brexit debate and the whole post-Brexit politics. So we have, and it's a village that by and large is Brexit, although it has some quite significant Remainers or Remoaners, whichever you like. No, I want to say this is not a novel about Brexit, but you know, I think if we're looking at dualities, we're looking at the contemporary, slightly not depressed rural life, but rural life that's subject to certain tensions, of which Murat, the gardener, whom Hassie hires to help her in the garden, is a significant target and indeed victim. And then we have the ancient past represented by the local saint, Saint Milberger, who great performer of miracles, but before that, the pagan past and the world of what's called the old religion of fairies and elves and sprites. And then within that, we have the duality of these two sisters. One is dark, one is fair. I can't say I deliberately did that, but now you mention it, of course, it is a significant duality. It's Snow White and Rose Red, I suppose, if we're talking fairy stories, and I suppose fairy stories are a bit relevant. And the kind of internal oppositions that both these sisters experience about the other, as well as, of course, the dichotomies in the parent-child relationship, father-daughter, mother-daughter. And as you say, Nash, trying to cover all your suggestions on your very interesting the Christian religion, which is fading rather significantly. There's a vicar with whom I'm rather sympathetic, who isn't really much of a believer, would really rather have played the piano, but goes into the church to please his own father. And the pagan religion, of whom Miss Foot, who's a rather significant character in the book, is a staunch supporter. And somebody said to me the other day, are you in the book? And I said, no, I'm not in the book. I'm never in the book. And nobody I ever know is ever in any of my books. But I usually have a character who will express at least some of my opinions. And in this book, it's Miss Foot.
She is a wonderful character. I was quite enchanted with Phyllis. Have you ever had the experience of moving to a village? You described the experience of being an outsider and seeking to become an insider, essentially, very well, and the tension between wanting to and not wanting to.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a very common tension. I've had it many times, actually. When I was married and my children were very small, we moved to a very small, isolated Oxfordshire village. Also, it was a tiny little cottage, thatched cottage, but it was also very old. And we were very much outsiders, and I had to really work hard to ingratiate myself, which did include shopping at the village shop and not driving into Bicester, which actually would have been more practical and cheaper, but I didn't do that. Then I moved a bit later in my life to a village in Somerset, also very small. And of course, just before lockdown, I rented this cottage in Wiltshire, which I still have. And there, actually, I was immediately accepted, but that's partly because I already knew people there. And it's a rather different kind of village. It's not much like Hope Wenlock, to be frank. It's a more, I suppose, dare I say, it's a bit more sophisticated village. Hope Wenlock is very like the Oxfordshire village I moved to when my children were very small. And I did find that was quite an education, actually. Learning not to rub people up the wrong way and fit in, but also keep a sense of privacy, because you are very commented upon. This was, when was it, 70s? So, it was a bit of a case of the neighborhood of voluntary spies, as Jane Austen calls it. My current village is much more like yours. It's a kind of much more sophisticated kind of a village.
I wonder if we could just touch on the title, The Gardener, and I think there are two suspects between Murat and Nellie East, but Penny Haynes, thank you for your note. Penny seems to suggest that perhaps Halcyon should really be viewed as the gardener, and I wonder if you have a view on this.
I think there are several gardeners. Most obviously, Murat is the gardener, in that he, as you say, is a linchpin. And perhaps I should talk about him a little bit. He's Albanian, he's a migrant. I chose Albanian because I know a number of Albanians. I spend quite a lot of time in Corfu, and I've been going there for over 20 years. And I actually have Albanian friends. So I didn't want to write, I actually have also got very good Polish friends who are migrants here. But I thought if I was going to write about a migrant, it would be wise to write about a migrant that came from a background that I'm familiar with. I'm bound to be accused of cultural appropriation, but I thought I would stick with what I know. And there are stereotypes attached to Albanians with which they are very familiar. I mean, all the ones that I know are absolutely charming. At this particular period, it's set in 2018, so 2 years after the referendum. But before we get through to the sort of Boris Johnson era, it's the era of Theresa May. There was a series of headlines, particularly in The Sun, about Albanian crack dealers and the Albanians running organized crime. So I felt that was appropriate because I wanted to show how, well, I didn't want to show, but my psychological background has confirmed my view that we project onto strangers, particularly strangers who are foreigners and don't necessarily speak our language, undisclosed elements of our own personalities. So we, if you like, project dark sides of ourselves onto them, and they become the target and focus of whatever we are blaming our current situation for. And poor Murat becomes just such a target. But in a more subtle way, actually, it probably comes through all in my books, this phenomenon that we project onto almost everybody an idea of who we think they are. And we find it quite hard to see who they actually are, because we want people to resemble our idea of them. And this is certainly true of Hassie vis-a-vis Margot, probably more Hassie vis-a-vis Margot than Margot vis-a-vis Hassie, because Hassie, of whom I'm very fond, and I think if you read the book, you would probably be fond, has a picture of herself as a rather good person. As she says, she's writing the book retrospectively, and she's writing the book to somebody, and we don't know who she's writing it to. until we get to the very end of the book. But she is writing it retrospectively, and by the time she's writing the book, she's learned a few truths about herself. But describing her own self at an earlier stage of her development, she does say, with Margot, I did tend to take the moral high ground, and Hassie does a bit tend to take the moral high ground, particularly where Margot is concerned. And she also has a tendency to do good. And not in this book, but in another of my books, I have one of the characters say, beware, beware of those who care, because people who care can often end up doing more harm than people who seem not to care so much. And Hassie does in fact do some harm, particularly to Murat, in an attempt to do good. So one of
Sally, you have somehow become muted. I don't quite know what's happened. Can we unmute you?
When did I become mute?
Just about 10 seconds ago.
Okay, I don't know how that happened.
No, I don't either.
So what I was saying is that Murat becomes the focus of hostility in the village, because they project onto him their dissatisfaction with the way things might be going in their own life. Hassie projects a certain kind of image onto Margot, and learning the nature of these kind of projections is part of what happens to Hassie as the book evolves. So I think Murat is a kind of primary target of that, in a way that perhaps migrants very often are. And I think that's something that, for better or worse, the whole Brexit debate threw up. I'm not saying everybody who was in favour of Brexit has necessarily something against migrants. That's not the point of the book. One of the points of the book in terms of psychology is that we don't really see people the way they are. People are always much more complicated and more subtle, and we definitely don't see ourselves the way we are. And I think it's that process of self-education that Hassie goes through, in particular with Margot, who seems much more indifferent, seems much more casual, but in some ways might be a more generous person, it turns out in the end, than Hassie. I mean, that's a bit for the reader to decide.
The process of unveiling those kinds of delusions, I suppose, is one of the ways you build up character. You allow people to see things and as they were not, and then to see them as they are, or more like they are.
Yes, I think I had at the back of my mind Great Expectations, where Pip narrates the story from, a bit like Hassie, from the vantage point of somebody who's come to understand and see himself better, who's more self-aware, and describes a period in his life when he was less self-aware. So Hassie's in that position. She's aware now, as she tells the story, of elements about herself that she's not aware of if you go through the story in chronological time. But I abandoned the whole question about who the gardener is. So the woman who used to own the house, Nellie East, is certainly a gardener who haunts, in some ways, the house and the story. Murat, whom Hassie hires to help with the garden, who knows nothing about gardening until he takes it up, but is clearly very intelligent and learns very fast and becomes indeed quite possessive about the garden. And then there's Hassie, who also becomes the gardener, but there's also Miss Foot, who is a kind of, I don't know what we would call her, who kind of oversees the garden, because she used to know Nellie East, who was the previous owner, who oversees Hassie and to some extent oversees Murat. So she's a kind of sharp-tongued but benign presence who I see as a kind of protective figure over the whole process. And then very, very, very a long, long way off, there is a reference to another gardener during the Easter service.
Sally Holter has checked in, wondering about the significance of Elfin in the story.
Elfin or Elfine?
Elfine.
Oh, yes. Well, Hassie, for those of you who haven't yet read the book, is an illustrator. She's been a rather superior illustrator of children's books, with an author who has sadly died. She had MS and died. And Hassie has had a love affair that's gone awry. And to escape from the unhappiness of that, she's gone to nurse her father in his last years in his house in Sheffield. And during this period, she's allowed her illustrating work to run down. And when he dies and she needs to get back to work, the only work she can find is illustrating a rather noisome set of children's books. And in my mind, they're the kind of books with which I'm very familiar because all children love them. And most parents and grandparents hate them because they are, they're very kind of crude, cartoonish representations of fairies and elves. And Hassie absolutely loathes this creature that she has to illustrate because it's extremely whimsical, very sentimental, all the kinds of things that her previous work as an illustrator avoided. And I had that in my mind actually before the book really got going. But it turned out that the ersatz Elfine stands in contrast to, what should we call them? More serious elves and fairies and spirits.
One of the delights of the book is the way you present quite seriously and subtly inserting the role of magic and what you would like to call it, otherworldly influences, and balancing the life of the village of electric lights against the dark woods and what you see or imagine or experience in the dark woods. Was that something you set out to do in advance? Do you plan that kind of, or is this something that you felt as a countryside book simply worked its way in?
I think the latter. I mean, as I said earlier, I did get very interested in this phenomenon called the other religion, which is the name given to the pagan religion, pre-Christian. So now we're talking pre-Roman. So we're going back really 4th century, 3rd, 4th century, maybe even earlier. And the other religion definitely believed in spirits and elves and fairies. Somebody who's read the book said that it had made them think of Puck of Poot's Hill, which is Rudyard Kipling's book. And actually that's quite interesting because that's a book I loved as a child. And of course, I don't directly have this referred to, but A Midsummer Night's Dream is one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. And that's very much in my mind with the wood. So and it also came through the character of Miss Foote. Now, Miss Foote appears in an earlier book. She appears in Dancing Backwards, which is a book which is set on an ocean liner crossing to America, so it could hardly be more different. And the person to whom the gardener is dedicated, John McCausland, said to me just before I started to write the book, I'd really like to hear more about Miss Foote. So I put Miss Foote in for John. Very, very sadly, John died during lockdown. It's one of the tragic cases of somebody who got cancer during lockdown. Because of the situation with the hospitals, it wasn't diagnosed in time. It was a galloping cancer. and he died. And so he never actually got to read what I did with Miss Foote. But he died before I finished the book, and I had him in my mind. And I think I felt that Miss Foote, who was somebody who did believe in other dimensions, but was definitely rather against the church. She has quite radical political views, apart from anything else. And I don't think she's in favour of the Church of England's views on gay marriage, etc. She thinks they are, well, she's in favour of gay marriage, and she's in favour of anything sort of radical. But she's also rather in favour of the old religion. So I think it came through her, actually. And as I was writing, to get to see Miss Foote, because their house, which is called Knight's Fee, to give it a name, is about 1.5 miles away. She has to walk through a wood to get to visit her friend Miss Foote, which becomes quite an important feature of her life. And as I was writing about this wood, and I really enjoyed writing about it, it started to take on this quality. Should I read you a bit?
It would be brilliant if you could read us a bit. It would be really nice.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, let me find a bit in the wood, because I think what I'll do is I'll read the bit where you're just beginning to get the first intimations. There's something a bit more about this wood than quite meets the eye. And the epigram of the book is there's always another story. There's more than meets the eye. And I did rather, well, partly have the holy wells, which are supposed to belong to St. Milberger, and I partly had the wood in mind. So, so she's setting out. Yeah, I think this is the first one. It was late afternoon, that moment when the light begins imperceptibly to soften towards dusk. Rooks were cavorting in rowdy acrobatics against a sky of celestial blue. In the field that led to the wood, shoots of tender young green barley were showing. Circumventing the field to mind the crop, I startled a couple of rabbits and watched their white scuts bounce as they raced off. A lark sheared up so close by my feet that I could see its brushed up crest like an untidy schoolboy's hair. It spiraled upwards into the ether and began a fierce, bright caroling. The lark ascending, my father had said, when I asked him what he would like at his funeral. No hymns, please, just the Bourne Williams. The copse had been quietly greening since I last walked there. The floor of the wood, in the light filtering through the pattern of leaves, had been transformed into a miracle of sapphire. Mingling with the seductive scent of bluebells was a heady smell of garlic from the star-shaped wild garlic flowers. Shards of sunlight flickering through the shadows lit up patches of bluebells, making them mirages of cool blue water. I halted by the pool where tiny insects were fizzing and watched a dragonfly, its sequined twig of a body never quite settling, shimmer just above the surface of the water like a magician's trick. As I watched, an echoing bolt of bright turquoise shot by, and I should explain, she's called Halcyon because her father's a bird watcher, and her surname is Days, and it's a sort of joke, Halcyon Days, but the halcyon bird was generally supposed to be a kingfisher. In the days of first knowing Robert, that's her lover, I had looked eagerly for propitious omens, a black cat, a white horse, a crescent moon to wish on. Now the kingfisher, my bird, appeared to carry some message or sign. I had with me Dad's old haversack, which I'd taken to carrying about to ensure I always had his bird book to hand. It made a useful outdoor cushion, and I set it down on a natural seat formed by the humped roots of the big oak and waited. I sat for some time, trying to ignore the insects whining about my head, first observing a bustling iridescent beetle, and then a lettuce-green angular-backed insect high-stepping fastidiously over the minute white flowers that embroidered the mossy surround. I'd never before taken much account of insects, but its intricate forms seemed to me now exquisitely delicate, and its colouring preternaturally green beside the green of the moss. Yet it's part of nature, so it can't be unnatural, I thought. A tiny snail with a translucent violet and yellow striped shell, climbing over a rotting log, began to fascinate me. I diverted myself by searching my mind for other unnatural seeming natural things, lightning and peacocks, stalactites and red-spotted toadstools, duck-billed platypuses and mistletoe, which last unfortunately led to a recollection of a stolen Christmas Eve with Robert, the kind of recollection I was trying not to have. I was distracted from this recidivist line of thought by the sight of a nuthatch making its way headfirst down another of the aged oaks, and then by a chestnut wren which began to thread bobbin-like through a thicket of blackberry, and all of a sudden a thrush on an overhanging rowan tree, its pale freckled breast puffed out, started up a refrain. Some way off, another thrush chipped in with an answering call. "But Dad, what about readings?" I had asked. "The darkling thrush, if you must read something. I like that one." He knew his birds. As if in response to the thrushes, a yellow bill poked out of one of the hazel bushes, and a male blackbird hopped out. It cocked its head on one side consideringly, then flew up onto a blossoming bough of wild cherry, paused for half a beat, and then began a melodious counterpoint to the thrush duet. But the silent imperial kingfisher, having once revealed itself, remained aloof. I awoke with a start, wondering where on earth I had been, until I felt the damp moss beneath my hand and the oak burl digging into my shoulder. The gold shards of sunlight had dissolved into a soft, silvery fan of fingers, and the drifts of snow-white windflowers had become puddles of ghostly pearl. The sky through the lacework of foliage was trailing ribbons of dark rose. From the echoing calls of the homing rooks, I deduced I had slept for over an hour. I had dreamt. There had been voices, a strange chanting, but as I tried to catch hold of it, the dream, already a fading echo, slid away from me, a mere tracery of notes into the gathering dusk. For one of those moments, which seem afterwards to have slipped outside time, I felt I might go after it, as though if I set off at once and followed the will-o'-the-wisp dream, I might find out some great, undisclosed, elusive secret. And then the moment passed, and I was alone in the darkening wood. In the checkered half-light, I stood wondering whether to turn back or go on, as I'd set out to do, havered, and then decided to go on. Dew was beginning to fall as I crossed the field to the village, so that my bare feet and sandals grew wet and cold. The sheep were already pale huddles in the twilight, beginning to hunker down, fretfully summoning their lambs to their side. I could see the crenellated shape of the church tower against the gold and scarlet and indigo-wrapped sky. The sun, now a burnished coin, was dropping down into a cleft into the ridged outline of Wenlock Edge. A whisper of the vanished dream wafted tantalizingly back, as if to tease me. The faintest ringing in my ears, not an especially tuneful sound, more like the far-off clink, clink of the bells worn around the necks of mountain goats, which I have heard at times echoing on Mediterranean hillsides. And then, as if the goats had passed on over to other pastures, the sounds drifted away again. Fret not after knowledge. Who was it who had said that?
That is wonderful and a brilliant scene with which to draw this session, I think, to a close and tantalize those of you watching who have not yet read the book. Enjoyed it so thoroughly. Sally, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. I'd like to suggest to all of you that you take a moment to unmute yourselves and share your wishes for a successful book with Sally. Sally, thank you. Look forward to seeing you in Much Ado in due course.
I hope so, very much.
So, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Adam, Susan, thank you for joining in. Anthea, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Well,
you all.
glad you could make it.
Thank you very much. It was very, very, very enjoyable.
Thank you.
I
Take
look
care.
forward to reading the book.
Good. I hope so. I hope you enjoy it.
Wonderful as
I
ever.
love grandmother.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And
Thank
Sally, most of
you.
all, thank you. What a terrible time. I really appreciate your flexibility and your support.
I will see you soon, I hope.
I hope to see you soon.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you in the shop in due course.
Yes. And
Thank you for organising it, Nash.
Oh,
once
it's
again.
such a
Many
pleasure.
thanks.
Thank you, Marguerite.
Yeah,
happy
great.
Christmas to all.
Bye.
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 Bye.